Thank you very much for coming to this event. I'm also very glad to have the participants here who are old friends in a way and have been on the circuit for quite some time in different configurations. Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston and Deborah Mesa and Anna Niemark and Andrew Atwood. So they're going to have like a tendency to talk about what they, have talked about at various sort of panels that they've been on together, no doubt. And they also pass through the GSD on a regular basis, although, some live here. But and so that circulation is no doubt creating a kind of camaraderie that I'm hoping will, sort of find a little more friction here, but not friction, not the unfriendly type of friction, but the friendly type of friction. So that's not my main purpose here. It's entirely collegial, but it is partly because the subject matter for me is complicated or complex. It's a subject matter that is huge, for one thing. I'm happy in a way that I'm not one of the people presenting, actually, per se, because it's like such a huge, even vacuous subject matter, and yet there are many lineages that can be detected in it. So I'm just going to do a little brief introduction. I'm not going to, the players you all know, really. I mean, they're very well known. And so you can, if you want to know where they went to school and so forth, they all have very good websites and so forth. But they're impressive people. They're doing major work right now and are incredibly important to all sorts of shifts, some of them generational and some of them discursive and some of them architectural in character. So I think it's very exciting that they've agreed to do this with me in a way. I want to pick up some ways of thinking about this question of the form from a variety of sources, and there are thousands of sources for this this concept. And I've been pursuing some of them in this class I've been teaching this semester, but also from a number of other places. First, though, it seems that some concept of form, however ephemeral, has always been with us in Western architecture in any case, although historically this lineage is very slippery. Obviously, form is related to the insistence of what we like to think of as a factuality of architecture, or the evidentiary sort of character of architectural objects, but also to the power of architecture as not just an object, but as a concept and proposition. Form's explicit dialectic with space in modernism and its engagement with function also is something we can call up at any moment in order to contend with the conflict and codependency latent in all three concepts of form, function, and space. Function is what the building does, form is the building structure, space is a production of form, function is what happens inside, form is what happens outside, form follows function like nature, function is social, form is artistic or typological or follows precedent, space is a void or a positive entity or virtual entity, and so forth. But there have been moments, and I think this is one of them, when these terms, and the role of form in particular, comes into question in new ways. This moment, which is getting more interesting by the day, I think, because of generational shifts that are seeking new nomenclatures in order to make our smooth criticality interrupt itself, and again, and study again aesthetics, formalisms, autonomy of architectural ideas, and criticality itself. This brings us to the immediate moment here, where we have these three offices or practices, their pairs, two pairs and then one part of a pair, when we will have three of these practices who are working on what I see as different planes of this process. I want to emphasize that none of what I am thinking about their firms or about their practices is meant to reduce their work to a kind of operative principles that I've come up with or something like that. But I'm going to tell you kind of what my original idea was when I was looking at their work, and then make a few more remarks about what happened when I did a little more homework on their work. And I think that it's fair to say that generally I'm not as interested in what their work means as in how it functions. And those aren't my words, of course. Those are sort of more Deleuze's words when he studies the work of Francis Bacon or something. So it was, so it's partly, that's not like me. Usually I'm looking for meanings, and meanings are embedded in function. So it's not or how things work. So it's not an absolute opposition. In Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee's work, I originally imagined, form acts as if it were function. The as-if formation allows two systems, form and function, to converge rather than oppose each other. Rather than oppose each other. So while remaining somewhat aloof, at the same time remaining somewhat aloof as a formal system, the buildings and projects of Johnston Mark Lee, which continue to be either all white or connected above and around the outside envelope, the structure, produce a kind of awkwardness of form that is working to also address the interiority of the building, the functions of the space in the building, the creation of spaces that are called, that the form calls attention to. And this, when this happens, I think it's always exciting. Awkwardness in my book actually is always a good thing, because it suggests that the argument has been open, some argument has been opened that hasn't been closed. It's still on my kind of preliminary analysis. In Deborah Mesa and Anton's Garcia Abril's work, sorry, Anton couldn't be here for this ensemble, form is a found object, but not a precedent. Instead, literally a quarry or a kind of geological or geo-industrial object. This is somewhat close to Rosalind Krauss calls the expanded field for art. The expanded field of architectural form breaks with normative scales, dimensions, regards the usual substrate of architectural labor as much more visible, much more haptic, much more tactile and unprocessed than its usual sort of institutional enfrainment or rule set. Not entirely like, not at all, in my opinion, like Super Studio Continuous Monument, which saw continuousness and scale, still immense scale, as a way of exceeding the material to translate the material into a kind of political statement, nor like Gaudi or even Baroque architecture, who use roughness as a kind of an ornament of rustification rather than sculptural massing. Perhaps more like Ensemble's work is perhaps more like introduction of strategic refinement to earthworks that Carlos Scarpa did. I mean, Scarpa seemed to be able to find more things to do with the ground than anybody else, or perhaps Gordon Matta Clark. And Niemark and Andrew Atwork's work in the first office firm, in my early look at their work, uses form that is self-aware of its desire for figuration and thus keeps itself in check. This self-aware form brings to mind other projects as well, again, not definitive, such as the case study houses at their L-shaped plans, with their L-shaped plans that kept doubling back on themselves and spending time looking at themselves. The figuration part is interesting because figuration is where sensation comes into play. It's where we begin to react to formal moves and the development of formal moves into figuralities that have, iconic sort of reference or whatever it is. This work is also the holding back from figuration of form is interesting. This work also reminds me of surrealism's informe, or the unformed, that is typically regarded in the sort of the various studies that were done on the informe by Rosalind Krauss and Yves Lambois as useless, therefore a useless form. Dali's clock, for example, in his famous, I forget what's called, time painting. Yes, persistence of time painting has no function. It's droopy. It's tired of telling time. It's in decline. So after my homework, though, I began to sort of refine or try to develop this so that it wasn't just a sort of rhetorical claim for these firms. I still agree with the form acting as if it were function. I find this sort of super interesting, this as if thing, again, that ability to bring things together, typically a posture as a sort of opposing arguments, as if it were function in Johnson Mark Lee's work. But I want to add some terms I took from, A House is a House, which was a book about their work, mainly the addition of the idea of a deep focus versus blurring, personification of inanimate objects, as well as visual weight. The author who wrote that book, I don't know what either Sharon Johnson or Mark Lee think about that, but these things are all, in my opinion, visible in the work, and yet they immediately began to make a relationship with Ensemble's rough and simultaneously luxurious treatment of material that might be seen as a sort of intentional kind of formal blurring. The way in which the rock or the mass that is taken out of the ground and is then burnished in some way or made to enclose in a particular way, or develops a sort of strategic, luxurious aspect that we recognize as possibly Mesian, I don't know, but in any case, it's not. But it's always shocking in a way to see this fantastic development of the rock strategically. And I think of that as a sort of formal blurring because the rock as such is still very present. The expanded field of ensemble still makes sense since it has enlarged our architectural scope to include much that is left as detritus and remains of industrial processes, but now I want to relate it to first office, which I found to also have a concept of expanded field, but in the opposite direction, leading not to large-scale earthworks, but leading to specified, precise formations of the useful but not interesting parts of buildings such as outlets, molding, conduit, paint, carpets, and vents, which we also typically ignore or forget about. In all cases, these crossings of these firms into each other have architectural cadences that we recognize and also are new to us. Form, through these practices and this discussion, can no longer stand on its own as a sort of autonomous closed entity, I don't think, precisely because of these crossings and also the breakout of, in these three cases of the let's say, the description of form as somehow unified and sort of completed. In all cases, also, these practices claim a kind of social, political dimension that is tied to the aesthetic dimension. First office, for example, is an important part of a generational shift in discourse, and I don't mean to attribute a generational power or force to to them alone. Of course, I mean, there's also generations always exerting, its desire for space, in the midst of the generation above, the generation below. And it's in search of not new styles, but of new nomenclatures that suggest modes of attention and decoding versus traditional models of interpretation, as Andrew Atwood writes at one moment. Or as Anna writes, regarding the installation Paranormal Panorama, one job of the firm is to keep architecture honest. And that honesty is a sort of moral obligation. It's not it's not a simple task. Not Interesting, which is Atwood's book, refers to alternative methods of attention, focusing, and we now hear in that word focusing, once again, sort of Johnston Mark Lee focusing, which is meant to critique automatic aesthetic judgments, so common to our architectural environment. Aesthetics for a number of practices now, via different paths, is the place where social, economic, political issues are now being explored, or are now being, studied. That it's the sensory as the sort of the domain of social justice, the aesthetic as the medium of social justice that is now being argued for in many firms. And I wanted to say also that that I think the use of the artwork in Johnston Mark Lee is importing or looking for a kind of interference, a social interference through photography, and Livia Corona's work on massive housing projects in Mexico and so forth are all coming into play in their work. So there's this social political platform that is embedded in some way, beginning to be embedded in the suspension of the form as a completed system or a completed object. As an ensemble also works routinely with communities finding ways to intersect environmentally in a responsible relationship to land and site. So form still retains some, and why it's true is an interesting question, still retains some of its kind of elephant-like presence, but it has lost the capital F for sure. It is still registering also the dynamic processes, or trying to register the dynamic processes we've been pushing and pushing for after the deep and long, though spectacular rigidities of modernism, not to mention the long-standing critical modalities that have now become an automatic and ever-present kind of hermeneutic, default position. Some of this, but not all of it, is generational. But architecture, I think, is again on the move. Bataille, by the way, argued, going back for just one more second to the informe, that the informe in Surrealism and elsewhere recomposed itself as into form at a certain moment. So it's possible that we're looking at a process that will then result or administer itself into a sort of formalism. It's happened before, it could happen again in history. And he's referring to the lumpy, truncated form that humans were given at a time when they were imagining nature and the kind of brilliant dynamic nature of other animals. Specifically, that whole discussion about the portraits in Lascaux of the animals on the wall, which are completed, that have full formal persuasiveness. And these signal for Bataille the clear condition of humanness that is beginning to shed its skin literally in order to molt into humanness. So it's a kind of pre-human condition, the truncation of the human form in relationship to the animal form, because it's molting into humanness. It's somewhat romantic and was sort of ignored by Rosalind Krauss and Eva Lambois for that reason, but it seems interesting in light of the how one fixes form at any given moment and compares it and relates it to nature and so forth. It suggests also, I think, that we might, that parable of the human form and the animal form might be sort of telling us something used in relation to the formless, how formlessness works, might be telling us something about how we have left, and this is why we're not entering a new phenomenological period, I don't think. We have left the natural, we're leaving the natural, the biological, the genetic, the autopoietic, the autonomous being who's, and we all think we're not doing that. We're getting more and more like that, but actually we're receding from it if we are interested in disqualifying interests, I guess, to just to riff on Andrew's not interesting, and also there are other versions of that I think that are happening now too. I mean, the whole place of the biological is a place of use and interest in things because we use them. We don't have a kind of sensory equipment that is interested in just entertainment or in shifting our attention without landing on the potential for use. And so in a way we're saying we're denaturalizing our attention in some way. And so that's either a paradox or conflict with the other ways in which the genetic is beginning to take hold of many of our practices and also of our, in our sciences and so forth. But I think it's interesting because it might help us end and begin the event really thinking that this problem of the form in question might be a problem of what has been naturalized in architecture. And that goes for the criticism as much as it's for the formal requirements, and the distinctions and the distinction between the factual and the conceptual and all these other things that we constantly engaged with. And so on that note, I would like to begin and introduce and have Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston start their presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for this invitation, and what a great introduction. That puts a lot of thought in our minds to digest. But I think when you were talking, there are three things that came to my mind, three isolated stories. The first was about unfriendly exchange. It reminded me of a time when I read the transcripts of Chicago tapes and Charlottesville tape, and then there are a few really unpleasant exchanges that I could even tell from the transcript. One was when after Tadao Ando presented, Leon Crea gave this kind of sarcastic clap. And then the second was, I think Leon Crea was attacking Matthias Ungers, and Ungers was about him being like selling his soul to the contractor and doing corporate scale projects. And Ungers was extremely agitated, and he said, I remember you when you were sharpening pencils in my office, and now you are up in the ivory tower and critiquing me and getting my hands dirty. So I thought that might be a nice thing to reenact. Maybe Anna and we can reenact that today at the discussion. The second thing that brought to mind was George Bataille. I think I read somewhere about Bataille talked about two forms of writings. There's one form of writing that stemmed from the desire to be experimental. And then there's another type of writing that stemmed from necessity and inevitability. And he said the one that stemmed from necessity is always stronger than the one that came from a more caprice or whimsical desire for experimentation. So I'm thinking in terms of function. I think function is often the raison d'etre for our professional work. And somehow the trick is about packaging something that it came from the desire to be experimental into something that is inevitable. And then the last story that reminded me of was Louis Kahn. It was a story that was written by Louis Kahn's engineer, Auguste Commandant, about Louis Kahn when he was presenting his project for Bangladesh. There was one moment where he presented to the president and the entire Senate, and then he was answering questions, and then suddenly one senator addressed the president that said, "Well, President, isn't we're an Islamic country? Why are we hiring a Jewish architect to design our state capital?" And Louis Kahn was completely ashen-faced and didn't know what to say. And the president said, "Well, because Louis Kahn is the best. Maybe I can answer your question by a story that in Ireland there was a private school that will offer a scholarship every year. And one year, the question for that scholarship was, who is the holiest person in history? And one of the Jewish students answered St. Patrick. And then he wrote a convincing article, a convincing paragraph. And the examiner said, but aren't you Jewish? You're Jewish. Isn't like Moses the holiest person for you? And the student answered, but yes, of course, but business is business. So ever since then, I think Kahn's religion or ethnicity was never brought up again, but it kind of stuck in my head. Maybe that has something to do with form and function. Anyway, let me see, how do I advance? So Catherine invited us to present two projects. We present two projects. One was finished last year, and then another one that will be finished by the end of this year. The first is the Menil Drawing Institute, located in Houston, Texas, in the Montrose area, a 30-acre campus. For those who haven't been, it's a special museum. It's a scattered museum, dispersed museum with multiple buildings scattered amongst a residential neighborhood. This 1971 photograph, you see the Rothko Chapel in the foreground, just finished in 1971. Louis Kahn did a master plan for the site in 1972 that was never realized. John de Menil died the next year, and then Kahn died the following year. But it's a special campus that was finally revitalized in 1987. Renzo Piano built his first building there, arguably his best building within this, what Rainer Banham called a neighborhood for art. So besides the institutional buildings, which consisted of two piano buildings, Rothko Chapel, Dan Flavin's last installation, Francois de Menil's Byzantine Chapel, there are also artwork by Michael Heitzer, Mark de Severo, Tony Smith that was scattered throughout the campus. And also these pre-war houses that the de Menils preserved. And also oak trees, various oak trees that some were older than 100 years. So this is the existing, when we got the project in 2012, this was the site plan. The gray buildings indicate all the public buildings within the campus. This is a master plan that David Chipperfield did about 2 years before we were awarded the project. And then, the point? Doesn't matter, but basically the gray square with the dark outline is the site where the Drawing Institute would be. This is the site that was given to us. This is the footprint that we suggested, like larger than what we think it should be, because it will be in dialogue with both the Cy Twombly building, the new energy house across the street, as well as the domestic scale pre-war houses around. This is what is on the site, a proposal to build courtyards first around existing trees, and then unite these courtyards. Very simple, very straightforward. This is our massing idea. These are early diagrams where we're thinking of very domestically scaled rooms for drawings, for works in paper. The collection were mainly, or majority of the collection was surrealist drawings. So very small scale, much better meant for domestically scaled rooms. Structurally, I think this conflict between like heavy and lightness is really embedded in the structure. Very heavy roof for the interior art spaces that insulates and protects the art. And then the outdoor rooms, these courtyard spaces, we try to make them as thin as possible. This shows a composition of the structure. Basically, it's plate steel that has ribbed in the interior and then cladded in cedar on the interior lining of the courtyard. That each of them span about 60 feet. I think for us, we look a lot into Otto van Eyck's Wheels of Heaven church project, where he talked about the courtyard being the entry space, and he talked about the courtyard as a space that belongs both to the building and to the outdoor space around you. So in many ways, ours is the same, 3 courtyards, and then the rooms are situated in between. We thought about different uses. We begin to collage these historical photographs of the events that the Menil sponsored, whether it be in the chapel or other spaces, from religious events, social political debates, book fairs, things that engages the community. So we're thinking of these spaces that could be interchangeable within this kind of roofscape that we have created, or that we will create. So this is the site plan. Zooming in, this is the first step, is the demolition of the apartment block, connect the streets, 2 buildings are built, and then the demolition of the rest. So this is what happened this last year. I think for works in paper, it's very sensitive to natural light. So the best places for drawings from light level is basically 50 lux or 5-foot candles. So for us, a lot it's about designing a sequence when you walk from the exterior, which should be 10,000-foot candles, and walking into a space that's only 5-foot candles. So how do you avoid this type of matinee effect from walking a dark space to a light space? And it's really creating a processional circulation where you walk through spaces that are semi-covered. We took advantage of the trees, the canopy of the trees, and the porches that for us is the lowest common denominator that delineates something that is architectural eventually to the gallery itself. So these are just some light studies, some sequences of how we walk from the outside to the interior. And then at the end, we situate the plan back into the family of all the plans of the campus, including the one on the lower right, which is not on campus, but which was Philip Johnson's house designed for the Menils in 1950. It was the first project that he did where he himself was not a client. But we think that a lot of the DNA of what Piano did later was already embedded in the original house, whether it's the organization of the space around the courtyard, having tropical plants was imported from Caracas, to having the dark floors. So same thing with the section, So in a way, our buildings height-wise is somewhere between lower than the Side Twombly Gallery, but taller than the pre-war houses. So we are hoping to recreate this moment in time. If you are there on the campus for the first time, we would like you to think that our building actually was built slightly before the Piano building, but after the pre-war houses. At the end, the steel panels with the ribs, the total construction is about 8 inches thick, in contrast to the much heavier boxes where the art spaces are. So the courtyard always becomes a room before one enters. There are 2 courtyards where you can enter through. Landscape was by Michael van Valkenburg with the oak trees and the marble from Vermont that's being scattered or fractured. Also, the telegraphing of the ribs through the steel plates. So it's not very abstract. For us, this is a moment of flaw or human touch that could be projected into the scale of something that seems quite monolithic. I think for us, basically 2 of the modules of the courtyard came together to recollect the gable-shaped roof of the surrounding houses. And even the dormers were created from these intersections. So we didn't start off with the gable roof in a way as a priori, but we wanted to create a module for the exterior where we bring something that is higher to something that's lower, that's more intimate scale. But when 2 modules came together, it forms this, what we call the living room. So these are the dormers that somehow indicate also where the entries to the 3rd courtyard, the cloister around the 3rd courtyard, as well as the galleries are. We look around the buildings of the Menil. There's something that is spiritual or non-denominational but liturgical. So whether obviously the chapels, but even the nave-like space in the Menil collection or the crypt-like space in the Dan Flavin installation. So while we're looking at domestically scaled houses or courtyard types, we're also looking at religious structures, particularly cloisters. So we're looking at these old medieval cloisters where there are cloisters, public cloisters where the monks or the nuns would interact with the general public, and then there are cloisters where they are completely internal or private areas. And this is one of that, which is connected to the drawing room, where works on art or works on paper are being examined for a short duration of time. And then this is the eastern courtyard. This is one of Elsa Kelly's last sculpture that's called the Menil curve, designed to be placed right in front of the building. And then this type of 12-foot wide module or porch that surrounds the building for us like a halo. Oh, okay.
So as Mark mentioned, this project, the UCLA Graduate Art Studios campus, is going to be finishing later this year, but actually started earlier than the Menil collection building. So that's the life of the architect. This project is sited in the Hayden Tract, which maybe some of you are familiar with as a place. Certainly not historically. It was a very kind of generic industrial landscape, but has been taken over by Eric Moss and his developers. So it has a kind of weird history of this very generic, almost mat-like urbanism and the agglomeration of these warehouses, but has been transformed quite a lot in the last 15, 20 years. So the UCLA Graduate Art Studios campus is one of the few buildings that's not on the main headquarters. So there's already this kind of satellite remote quality to it, and it's made up of a kind of nice, clear, and simple old warehouse. It was a wallpaper factory, and these agglomeration of kind of not very functional buildings attached to it like barnacles. And I think when we began the project, it was a very kind of immersive dialogue with faculty and students. And so we really began with thinking about the sort of how artists make work, and the idea of the artist studio, the factory, all these different scales of kind of collaboration, from Ed Ruscha working with this giant pencil with his face 2 inches from the table, to the kind of collaborative way that Albers would work with his students. And so that began to suggest different scales of space and a kind of maybe programmatic indeterminacy in the way that spaces should function. And I think also, on the other hand, thinking about how the landscape of where artists produce and share their work is also expanding beyond the gallery. So performative spaces, kind of really in the way that artists are engaging the city, disused buildings, all of that made us also think about the kind of idea of the art studio, the place of learning for an artist, also needed to have a kind of indeterminacy. And as we've thought about a lot of our projects that are involved in the arts that also often require a lot of kind of flexibility and adaptability and a sort of indeterminacy in terms of how they might be used into the future, the warehouse, the factory, and the palazzo have always been two typologies that have fascinated us for their, in a way, kind of genericness that allows for this flexibility. So these initial studies and the first part of the project were really about erasing the sort of superfluous buildings, expanding the envelope of the space, and extending the roof. So we had a kind of pure volume of space defined by a ground plane and a roof. And then we began with the sort of most elemental integer of space, which was the artist studio, and began to create a neighborhood around that was defined not by necessarily the form, but the way that these individual studios would agglomerate. And so this early scheme began with a neighborhood of studios in the old warehouse, and then an assembly of kind of generic, repetitive volumes that housed labs and classrooms and kind of new programs that were being brought to the campus. And it resulted in a little bit of a sort of urbanism, mini urbanism within this precinct, with a kind of hierarchical set of more public programs like streets and arcades. And so the kind of language of this industrial building, the bow truss structure, we were quite kind of systematic about repeating and scaling that up to accommodate the new program that formed the buffer around the historic building. And so the project was really about sort of trying to re-examine this taxonomy of industrial elements, the truss, in this case a steel structure, the different permutations of the bow truss, the Verandil, and how they began to become kind of programmatic drivers, space-holding elements that would determine how the landscape of the functions would be arrayed and also qualities of the atmosphere. So here we introduce a new translucent roof that mirrors the historic roof of the warehouse, and began to look at different scales of space, cantilevering a new kind of scale or sort of notion about structure. The project was on hold for a while, and when we came back about 3 years ago to develop the project, as it was funded, qualities, the project evolved into perhaps a more kind of abstract idea of the here we really went back to the roots of industrial buildings in Southern California, so it's tilt-up concrete construction, and began to transform the kind of stick form of the bow truss into a kind of long-span glue lam structure. And that resulted in a much more kind of horizontal and serial structure for the language of studios and collective spaces. So the sort of hierarchy of arcades and other kinds of service spaces and public spaces is erased into this more flat kind of horizontal field plan. So you can see the two scales of the bow truss of the historic building and the kind of long span of the new glue lam, and the scale of space that's introduced. So there, within this new perimeter, there's a series of yards, as we call them, that are covered but unconditioned spaces that allow for this continuous ground to connect all of the entire campus, which is about 55,000 square feet. So this kind of enfilade creates continuities between interior and exterior spaces. And then the third yard is a entry space, a garden, but is also equally functional as a production space for students. So I think also, especially given it's Southern California, the kind of ambiguity of what's interior and what's exterior, where the garden begins and ends, was something that we were interested in, and the way that the kind of trace of this historic space, which is the center bay in the existing warehouse, is transformed in its scale to mirror and sort of echo those exterior yards. And then the neighborhood, the sort of cul-de-sac-like loose arrangement of the artist studios, 40 of them which are in the warehouse. And then those exterior yards also begin to function as gardens. The language of the building also became, in a way, maybe more generic as we began to really go back into the legacy of industrial buildings in Southern California, thinking about its tilt-up construction. So we looked at that legacy, of course, in industrial buildings, but also in the work of Irving Gill and even Schindler. So that became a kind of interesting problem for us of where to find the detail in the project. So simply in the way that we began to develop the casting of the molds is really where the architecture emerges. So here is the warehouse under construction, and you can see in this image some of the molds for the tilt-up walls. So these, I don't know how much they weigh, but they're very large, about 30 feet tall, and they surround, so the entire building was erected in about 3 days in terms of the perimeter. So just a quick run through that process, and then they're infilled with columns to form this continuous enclosure. And that's it. Yeah.
Oh, this is bright. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, maybe I should have been a couple, but don't worry, you'll see Anton in some virtual form as I explain and we visit the projects. So I agree with Catherine in some of the, or I want to agree with Catherine in some of the comments that she was making when seeing our practice as operating in this kind of expanded field, no? Because we do look and seek beyond the boundaries of architecture. And we believe that architecture is really able to push in its tentacles into many other places for inspiration or for knowledge. So our practice and our work, you can see a small sample here on our working desk. It does explore, no, and different projects are not, or each project is not the final realization of an idea, but ideas travel from project to project, and we see our different works, whether built or unbuilt, as these steps in the process that allow us to get some experience and also open paths for investigation and for research. And in our work, let's say the world of ideas, the intelligible world, it is certainly in constant tension and in constant negotiation with the sensible world and the world of the physical. We see ourselves and we operate both as architects and as builders of many of our works, and these has given us a kind of training, a way of thinking about architecture that brings together matter and form in a very strong way throughout the whole process. So we find a lot of inspiration in the things that surround us, in the places that we visit, in the transformation of the landscape, in understanding the cycles of transformation of matter and trying to understand also the impact of our actions in the environment. And the way we think about architecture and the way we design architecture, where the model and the prototype takes certainly a big role, is, I think, very illustrative of this tension and constant negotiation between matter and form. So these are the two works I'm going to we're going to visit today. I decided to choose two works that share the material, concrete, but a concrete that takes, as you can see, very different forms. And where I think a common thing of both of them is a clear identification of the structure, the space, the form, a kind of honesty, or from our own perspective, legibility that is important to us, because, as I was saying in the beginning, these works are not meant to be dead ends, but they are our prototypes. They are a step or a stage in our itinerary as architects that are discovering for us a lot of very important values that we then apply to other works. So maybe some of the things that I will, or some of the differences that I will describe as I talk about these two projects are, how they deal very differently with things that are certain and things that are uncertain. And whereas the Hemeroscopian house, in a way, departs from existing technology and has to embrace certain rules of the game, structures of landscape in the lower part is really about reinventing the rules of the game to make it happen. So, to start talking about the Merscopian house, I wanted to bring this component of the house that has a very fixed form and that certainly takes an important presence in the making of this house. This standard element is a precast concrete beams that were not an imposition of the project. Actually, for us, they were kind of objet trouvé. They were, we accidentally found them when visiting a precast concrete factory, but then we decided to use them to build our own house and to explore how could we use these standard elements using some of its rules, but maybe discovering or questioning others. So these structural part, this pre-stressed concrete beam, has a precise form, a form that is based on its structural optimization, that is also subject to certain processes of fabrication, questions of interchangeability, of repetition, and also follows other logics of logistics, no? Of transportation, of assembly, rules that we needed to learn, no? And that we were, these big parts are typically seen building civil engineering works. They are built, or they have the scale to serve infrastructural works, bridges, highways, water channels, and we needed to learn some of the logics that were embedded in those forms that we were going to appropriate and use. But of course, there are other dimensions to these works, no, that have to do with our own experience, with the works that we have learned from, and in this case, these 4 works very close to us in Madrid, in Spain. Eduardo Torroja in the top left corner. Miguel Fisac in the right corner using some pre-stressed concrete beams, in this case not standard, that he was designing himself, and then Fernando Higueras in the bottom left, that actually today it's the opening of a very interesting monographic exhibition in Madrid about his work. He's maybe one of the less known internationally, but very interesting work. So with the different conditions affecting the work or interest or curiosity to use this technology at the scale of civil engineering works, but wanting to decontextualize it and bring it to a domestic space, we started to think about the space of the house. And we're from Spain. We wanted to have a courtyard house in a suburban area of the city. And by the positioning of these elements, we are embracing this very central space that will organize the different spaces of the house. So we take these standard parts that are given. We cannot customize them because that would make the house very expensive. So we take the standard formworks. We preserve some of the functions, like this beam is typically used for aqueducts to move water. So we use it as the swimming pool of the house. But when these elements arrive to the domestic space, they become not just resistant parts, but that carry the loads, but they become, as I was saying, the swimming pool. They become the partitions, they become the facade, they become the finishes, the windows that frame the views. They organize the spaces, they give the beat, the order. And once the structure is finished, the architecture is there. So with this house, we are trying to explore how we can use these very standard elements in a non-standard way. Something that we are really interested in, not just in this work, but in many others. And we are also understanding how to deal with prefabrication, the importance of controlling the process of highly engineering it, but then also discovering some qualities about transparency, about communication of spaces, this matrix of spaces that the house organizes, and that invites a very social and connected lifestyle. Despite being built by very heavy parts, the house is actually very transparent in the way that the spaces communicate and frame the landscape. So, I'll speed up. So the lessons that we learned here, they get translated into other of our works, And as I was saying, this is not a dead end. It is a project that inspires other works. The things that we discover, we take them back to the scale of the infrastructural, to the scale of the city, and here we are thinking about how to use some of the things that we have learned to question and reframe other typologies, like the typology of the tower, creating a more three-dimensional framework that provides the kind of basic functions, guarantees the resilience and the functionality of the building, but then is able to bring a lot of spatial richness, and create scenarios that enable variability and mutability. So we control certain aspects and open up for the building to adapt to its different functions and needs across time. So there are contexts, like the ones that I was showing before, that are very strict rules of the game. It's hard sometimes to find spaces of freedom for experimentation. But there are other contexts where it was hard for us as architects to find what the rules were, what the constraints were. And this is a project that we built in Montana a couple of years ago, Typology Art Center, on a working ranch. And the project is an art center in this 11,000 acres property, where the program or the conditions was to design a place where art could be exhibited indoors, that would interact with other outdoor works, that would be compatible with the ranching activity of the place, and that would require little maintenance. So, and also a very important requirement from the client was that the architecture would not enter into conflict with the wilderness and the loneliness of the place. So we decided that the kind of white box museum type had no fit here, and we had to reinvent, what were the departure points? What was what were the conditions with which we were going to work? And certainly the land was an important presence to consider. We decide the center is going to be fragmented and scattered across the site to really invite visitors to explore the place, to get lost in the place, to experience that wilderness, that loneliness. And the process of design is it's a hands-on process where we are trying to learn from the land, from its processes of transformation, from geology, from erosion or fragmentation, sedimentation, how we can create a space through explosion, like you were seeing in the bottom right. And in a way, we develop our own catalog. We develop our own language of spaces, and we develop a technology that makes sense in that very remote context, almost reorganizing the matter of the place. To discover architectures that can relate to the land in a very strong way, that are almost like extensions of it, like this bridge, this fountain that is giving water to the visitors, this place of academia, or this theater that tries to represent the acoustic space of the mountains. So from the process of design takes the model as the departing point and those experiments that I was showing before. And from the model, the different, let's say, design, the other design phases unfolds. Not in a very conventional way, but the things that we really want to control is how we are going to build these structures, and we need also to define those rules, how, not just for pragmatic reasons, but also poetically, those structures of landscape need to be born from the ground. They need to be cured, they need to be casted in that in the land, and then tilting them, and then also, of course, this is the best way. Instead of using more complex scaffolding. So these that I'm showing now are the three structures that we have built. These drawings are showing you the way in which we are already, through the drawing, thinking about those processes of construction that we were also exploring in the initial stages. And then Domo, which is a larger structure that we're not moving it in any way, so we are molding the ground to accommodate it and then removing the ground to discover the space. So this is, in a way, the recipe, something that, the same way I was showing how Emeroscopion House influenced other projects, this project, if you know the project of the truffle that we did much earlier, certainly feeds and benefits from some of the research and discoveries that we made there. So from the early models, let's say the construction stages of the project evolve also through prototyping, then at larger scale, almost rehearsing, putting into practice how we are going to get this built on the site. This is not the site yet, this is not Montana, this is in Galicia, actually the plot where the truffle is built, but we are already designing and putting in practice the sequence of construction, deciding what things we are going to control and will be certain, and what things have big tolerances and we can allow to adapt to the site. Because the site is a very extreme site, and we actually, a big part of the construction happened in the winter, and so once on the site, we guarantee the structural integrity, we guarantee the acoustical performance of these structures that are meant to hold concerts and make the sound travel. We guarantee certain thermal properties that we embed in the form by the manipulation of the textures and the placement of the reinforcement, but then there are a lot of other aspects that are left for improvisation. And the moment of discovering of the work, the moment of unearthing of the work, is a moment of surprise in a way, where we are ourselves discovering things that we could have, we had no way of anticipating. And this is a moment where we actually realize how the building sounds, how all those properties that we have embedded are really performing. But also we discover a incredible ambiguity, no, of the work that sometimes operates as art, playing with the other outdoor sculptures situated on the site. Other times it becomes a shelter that provides shade or a roof to protect from the elements that are very present there, very strong. It is a work that is changed by the elements. It is a work that is not afraid of being, of that process of change, of that exposure to very extreme conditions. No? And it's a work that does not need maintenance. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, Deborah and Anton make very large dolmens, we make very small ones. So it's a kind of tough act to follow, but here we are. Thank you, Catherine. And also, of course, Mark, Michael, for your response, and everyone on the panel for inviting us to this event. We're so happy to come back to the GSD. Catherine's prompt to return to the modern problems of form and function led us to reconsider our work through these terms, which has been extraordinarily helpful. So today we'd like to define these terms in conceptual work and then argue for what we are calling a post-conceptual position. I'll start us off with an introduction leading to some familiar images, our early projects that you may recognize from presentations here last year and an exhibition at the GSD. And Andrew will then show a new house that we're working on right now and conclude with some thoughts on attention and awareness that Catherine alluded to earlier. To define what we are calling a post-conceptual position in architecture, we have to return to that Design Quarterly issue, number 7879, put together by John Margolis. In his letter to participants, Margolis outlined clearly that he was not interested in the traditional magazine format of ordered text and pictures. Rather, he wrote that he was looking for a mere general and less specific type of communication. We all know that this more general and less specific type of communication became, for Peter Eisenman, the blank essay titled Notes on Conceptual Architecture. And at first glance, this act of publishing seemingly nothing may appear nearly ordinary for 1970. By that time, everyone was familiar with Robert Rauschenberg's Erased Koenig drawing from 1953, Jean Cocteau's depiction of the blank poetry book titled Nudisme in his film Orpheus from 1949, and John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence composed in 1952. Perhaps what made this particular submission so radical was that it came from a discipline that was rather conservative and quite professional. And what's possibly even stranger is that this conceptual act did not really generate any heightened form of self-awareness or in-depth discussions on medium specificity in this field. With only a few exceptions, arguably we might even say that there hasn't really been a full-blown conceptual moment for architecture. So in preparation for today, we reread in log Mark Jerzombek's short essay on Eisenman's publication. Jerzombek reminds us of the labor required on the part of the architect to try to use this historiographic apparatus of the footnote to create a conceptual position. Arbeit ohne Opus, or work without over, Jerzombek calls it, or to use Margolis's words, a general type of communication without any particular authorial voice or any special conclusive argument. It is Eisenman's conceptual framework and Jerzombek's love for this weak art that reminds us that to think in architecture is, tragically enough, to think historically. I'd like to offer another thought on the relationship of conceptual form to history that could now be understood as a post-conceptual act. As we see in Eisenman's notes, it is only fitting that conceptual forms are also always necessarily nearly blank forms, as they present a position of extreme self-awareness. The function of a blank form is to identify the general format that could be filled in by specific content. And to give you a visual of what we mean by blank forms in general, we include here the blank form for documenting the fingerprints of an applicant and another blank form for certifying a death of a person. Eisenman's erasure was like taking the specific information out of a form and rendering it blank, and therefore as close as architecture would get to a concept. By contrast, we see our projects as the action of filling out forms much like these. As we fill out blank forms, we feel like we're certifying or making things certain, specifying the generalities, or simply writing. Roland Barthes argued for the writerly over the readerly, restoring each text not to its individuality, he wrote, but to its function, subjecting it from the outset to a basic typology. This is the general form of writing, the first conceptual position. But the practice of writing also leads to a post-conceptual position. That is, to produce a writerly project in architecture, we work on specifying the materials, sizes, and programs of blank forms. I'd like to briefly revisit our work with these thoughts in mind. It's only fitting that I begin with Malevich's white and white painting from 1918. This painting truly is, in its form and content, a blank-on-blank document. Our project, one of the earliest we did together, filled out the blank with office equipment. And to remind us of Catherine's terms here, the painting became the blank form for an office function. In fact, we did it several times, every time a bit differently. We filled it with tabletops, table legs, chairs, scale figures, roofs, walls, one column, all that stuff of architecture. Another blank was taken from Marcel Duchamp, a door built for him by a carpenter in his apartment at Rue Larrey. In specifying this blank for the functional, structural, and decorative requirements of a shotgun house, we incorporated it into the unfilled plan to produce a heightened degree of confusion. The doors are doubled and set into the context of 2x4 light frame construction. They produce hiccups in the measurement system that leads to functional differences in an otherwise gridded plan. Any gaps that ensued were seamlessly decorated with continuous molding profiles. And the exigencies of construction filled in the original blank photograph with a junk space of framing, conduit, molding, and baseboard, even including the replacement of one of those 2x4 studs with a 2x6 to accommodate the space for a doorstop. Most recently, we have discovered an alibi in dolmens. And to us, these rootstone monuments represent prehistoric blank forms. They're confusing to us now because we don't know how to occupy them in any way we know how to live. In these early photographs by Truta, there's an equal ambiguity about how to ride the modern car or a prehistoric object. And Le Corbusier is here for a reason, because we think we can find a writerly function for these now in 2019. At first glance, the domino and a dolmen are sort of similar. The floor plate of the domino is the capstone of the dolmen. The pilotis of the domino are the upright stones of the dolmen. There are bays in both, which may be repeated in the long direction indefinitely. There's a loosely defined interior. There's an elongated floor plan. So naturally, we can jump to the next question and ask, could the dolmen also be considered structuralist? And here we begin to run into some fundamental differences between the two diagrams. The dolmen is not authored. It is not a model for other architecture. It is not one prototype, but there are many specimen types. And so unlike Eisenman's domino, dolmens behave informally. So to bring back Catherine's term of the inform. They do not produce a clear syntax. If anything, they mumble, they stutter, they babble. We can throw all the tools of formal analysis at these, but they remain rather mute. For us, this example of early blank form can begin to identify the informal and informal analysis, which allows us to talk about things like posture, contrapposto, relationship to the ground, character, as well as descriptions of texture, tonal value, and attitude, en face and in profile, high tolerance, shade and shadow. These qualities are difficult to pinpoint exactly, but we have to specify them nonetheless. So we work myopically on paint sheen, screw drives to render these general blank specific.
So if our position, as Anna discussed, is a post-conceptual one of loose fits and high tolerances, then this requires us to, and that requires us to then fill in blank forms and cover up gaps, whether by writing, decorative molding, or any of the other techniques that Anna discussed. The question more recently has been how that translates into some of our newer built work. I think it's in the transition to these kinds of buildings that we might find the next step in a post-conceptual approach to architecture. One that tries to reconcile some of the ideas found in earlier work with each other, as well as forms of blankness that many of those projects didn't have to deal with, things like clients, contracts, and specifications. So unlike a lot of that earlier work, our buildings are not so much about maintaining conceptual purity through a representation of a single logical process or idea, but instead our buildings are presented as a kind of loose fit between stuff like this, a blank AIA contract, and a document that explains the division titles for master format specifications, as well as our previous ideas, processes, precedents, and projects, all of what we admit with the intention that these things, at least initially, do not come so neatly together. In other words, rather than have a project about dolmens, a project about games, a project about Malevich, or a project about specifications, our more recent work clears out a post-conceptual territory by embracing the inconsistencies, non sequiturs, and logical gaps found between all of them, and working in the blank spaces produced by them. All done in the hope that our buildings express a degree of tolerance and perhaps sympathy through the details and reveals that fill in the gaps of their final forms. Perhaps it's our attention to these gaps that Catherine has in mind when she uses the term self-aware when describing our work. So with this in mind, we thought we'd briefly show sort of two projects. One, a building that we're hoping to build in Virginia, and then I'll conclude with some thoughts that'll sort of work through my recently published book. So the first project we want to talk about is called Battleship House, and this is maybe an example of a project that has sort of escaped the kind of myopia that some of the earlier projects that were sort of insistent on driving a kind of single idea all the way through a project, and instead sort of relishes in, let's say, the spaces between lots of different ideas and tries to figure out how they might go together, even if it's awkwardly at first. And so in the Battleship House, it takes a number of different precedents, and despite the fact that it's called a battleship, it gives no precedent to that as a precedent, and that is the game Battleship, which you see the board on the left, a drawing of Carl Andre's cuts in the middle, and then the plan of Mises' Barcelona Pavilion, and then mixes with these things some of the diagrams that Anna showed, Peter Eisenman's formal analysis of the Maison Domino, our own informal analysis of a kind of series of dolmens, and then non-standard flashing and coping types, and tries to sort of find a space or a position in between all of these things without really trying to resolve them necessarily, but sort of reveal the gaps that might exist between them and try to find adjacencies that we wouldn't expect as we work through the project. And so the project sort of unfolds through a series of processes. In some ways, some of them are related to games, and so this takes lots of different things from the precedents, including some of our own work, and identifies sort of infrastructural cores that you might read as things that came from Carl Andre's drawings or just the legs of a dolmen. It can kind of be either simultaneously, and then begins to arrange them on a grid, thinking in terms of someone like, let's say, wow, there's supposed to be lines in that grid. Something like Mises' plan for the Barcelona Pavilion, and then looks at a different way in which we can arrange them in ways that begin to sort of add up into what ultimately became the kind of small house in Virginia. And so these are just some foam core models. Again, it was meant to be blown out, but maybe not that blown out in the upper left. And then so also simultaneously tries to look at these things both as solid and also as a series of infrastructural cores, as I mentioned, and looks at these, really doesn't try to judge one as better than the other. It's just a kind of plain board where you can arrange and look at the relationship between these different legs or cores and the different programmatic arrangements that might happen in the blank spaces between them. So this is a plan oblique of the drawing, and it's meant to refer back to some of our earlier stuff. Again, always sort of like hitting these things sideways with a kind of corporate knowledge that we've developed in previous work. And so here is the site. It's a house. It's actually a historic house in the backyard of a historic house, which butts up against the campus at the University of Virginia. And so it's a brick house that also is sort of adjacent to a kind of world of Jeffersonian brick across the street. And so we've developed a kind of antagonistic relationship with that material type, which I'll talk about in a second, through a kind of different understanding of battleship as an idea. So this is a plan, and it's basically a two-story house. It takes advantage of a new ADU ordinance in Charlottesville, and adds to an existing property, and it's essentially a kind of a new home for the person that lives there, because the property is valuable as a rental property. It's very straightforward in terms of its program. And then these are the sections. And so again, you can see the different ways in which different precedents sort of show up, both in the legs of the dolmen you can see on the outside, but also things like coping and, let's say, gutter downspouts, etc. And then again, taking inspiration from some of the flashing reveals and coping details from a previously built work, which is also in Virginia. And so some of the details are the same. And so for obvious reasons, clients don't like kind of oddly tilted roofs on their buildings that the gaps are actually open to the outdoors. And so we've tried to find a sort of area for that by just looking at the different transitions between things like horizontal and vertical siding and a kind of intentional flashing reveal to show that sort of space as a kind of nod back to, again, some earlier work. These are renderings of the project, which I tried to swap them out. These are old. I only show them because the idea for it is to sort of, this kind of idea about simultaneous narratives sort of working through the project is to sort of capitalize on Battleship, not just as a game, but also a color. So Battleship gray is sort of ubiquitous as a color that you can find in things like paint, the different ways in which you might dye concrete, in standing seam metal roofs. And so the idea is to sort of find Battleship gray in all its different variants, and then just make sure that we specify that all the way through the project. And so in the end, you get a kind of monochromatic project, ultimately with different shades of gray, but all called in the specification Battleship gray. Okay, how are we doing? As usual, I'm the most excited person about exactly that idea. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Not interesting. Okay, lastly, this more diffuse approach to the post-conceptual is addressed at least tangentially through some of the ideas and the form of my recent book, Not Interesting. And I say this in the acknowledgments. The only reason that Anna's not sort of listed as an author is because it's a little bit too dumb for her. So it's very much inspired by our relationship, but she would never put her name on something like this. I had to put it in the acknowledgments, like at the top. But the book, generally speaking, is about different forms of attention in architecture. Attention being a kind of key word, and that's actually the title of the first part of the book. And Catherine's prompt about self-awareness got us thinking about the relationship between something like attention on one hand and awareness on the other. Or perhaps more specifically, between a kind of continuum between interest, which I would say is a specific and focused form of attention, and awareness, which we might describe as a more general, more diffuse form of attention. And if we look at awareness in this way, we begin to see a series of overlaps between some of the issues introduced by Anna, as well as two of the forms of attention that stand in loose opposition to interest. And you can see it on the left of this semiotic square, confusion and boredom, two words that many people, and maybe more people in this room after this talk, have used to describe our work. And so the book essentially sort of works through the kind of format of the text, a la Eisenman and some of the other things that Anna discussed. But I wanted to talk specifically about boredom as a kind of mode of attention that which I think overlaps with some of the things already discussed, which is to say boredom as a form of attention that occurs when an expectation of interest is not met. And it requires us to confront our own kind of creative limits by filling in that expectation with our own ideas. As such, boredom often makes us aware of our own limits by forcing us to pay attention to things with which we are only generally or peripherally aware of. And all of this, I think, happens in different ways throughout the book in the kind of organization of the text, which oscillates between, let's say, boring, a kind of unusual ordering, and then the kind of frustration of not being able to see an entire project on one page. And then also sort of devolves towards the end in a series of just informal footnotes with various quotes and kind of loosely held together by, let's just say, the workings of my own mind and the sort of frustration of just having to finish a book by a deadline. And it includes things that also I find to be deeply architectural, if not architecture themselves, things like icebergs, and then obviously buildings, the dolmens, obviously, and then other works. And maybe this is sort of what a post-conceptual position might be, a kind of awareness of being aware, a sort of meta condition that we might call self-awareness, at least to the degree to which we try to be more conscious in our work, more specific, or as Anna likes to say, just more honest about these more diffuse, more ambiguous, more general forms of architecture, architectural communication, and our own practice. Thank you.
Is that okay? So I am completely aware of how long you've been sitting there, and Catherine anyway said I had only 10 minutes. Catherine does this to me, and Mosen does this to me. So you have to do this, but you have only 10 minutes. Yeah. So I'm going to put a timer to prove I can do it. I've been trying to think through lately some contemporary practices, and the three couples that are represented here today are certainly among the things I've been thinking about. And what I've proposed to myself is I've actually found more in common with these very, very diverse practices than I have differences. And I'm going to try to start the discussion by pointing to that commonality. And I want to follow directly on Anna and Andrew's notion of post-conceptual, and I want to add to that what I think we could call pre-cognitive, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And I really mean a practice that makes objects that are not meaningful, that refuse meaning. And it's this refusal of meaning and its replacement by what I'm going to be calling a materiality of a certain kind of marking or tracing. And I think the footnote is exactly the right example. The footnote is a trace of an absent source. This working. So the marking or a tracing of these marks are not perceivable as signs. They are not metaphors. They have no referent. And it's the materiality of those marks. What Paul de Man and Derrida, I think, has a similar, the materiality of inscription. And I was reminded, and I quickly found it when you were talking about blanks. There's a passage from Aesthetic Ideology where Paul de Man says that the materiality of inscription is an event that is as undeniable as it is totally blank. And I want to try to explain that using some of the work that we've seen tonight. This is not my clicker. The green dot. That's the laser. Okay. Let's go back. This is the truffle that Deborah mentioned that is kind of a prototype of some of the work she showed. I have to read very, very quickly Deborah and Anton's almost ritualistic description of how this was made. To build it, we made a hole in the ground. If you listen to me on Lacan, you know how important the idea of starting with a hole is. Piling up its perimeter, the topsoil removed, we obtain a retaining dike without a mechanical consistency. Then we materialize the air of the building by building a volume with hay bales and flooded the space with earth and built the solid air, as it were. The poured massive concrete, she goes on, and then Paulina, you can see Paulina here. Oops. Paulina comes, eats the hay away, and you're left with the truffle. And then she said, we had fabricated a stone, and then we made a few cuts. Now, what I want to suggest is that it is only when the cut is made, when the event of marking this lump, this inert, There's no way of making a metaphor, a referent. There's no way of making a semiotic reading of that inert lump. But when the cut is made, at that moment, it becomes architecture. The event of inscription, and it becomes architecture because it makes something like a face, and only when that surface is understood as an intentional marking can we then say that these are actually walls. Before the cut, they weren't walls. They were just part of a lump. Not only can we say that they're walls, that is to say architecture, we can say that now this is a base and that it's emerging from the earth, and we could start quoting Heidegger about Greek temples and earth and sky and air and Paulina bovina, the cow, right? He said even animals follow the architecture, and all of a sudden we have architecture by this blankness of, but the intense materiality of inscription. Now, you think then that something work like that of Mark and Sharon would be exactly the opposite. It's obviously, we would first start by calling it formalist, probably. What I want to say instead is that there's still a kind of marking and an inscription going on. I'm trying to go fast and I'm losing my way, but if the truffle is this kind of grunting and babbling, I believe the vault house is a kind of stuttering. And let me make that into the point that the the vault is shifted, moved, repeated, turned upside down, turned sideways, and stretched. The vault, and look how graphic it is. It's an immaterial, very graphic, non-tectonic. So in the end, it's not a vault. It's a kind of stutter that may have started off as a vault, but it ends up being a kind of emptiness because of the manipulation and the repetition. And it's important, I think, that by going through this kind of Boolean addition and subtraction, and vault of different sizes, vault of different orientations, vaults even on the ground, turned sideways, that it turns into a series of signifiers that can no longer mean something. And I would say what we really get is a signifier in solitude called arch, but we get nothing about the particularities of the particular arches, and that's not a signifier, that is an inscription. And it's through that bluntness of, and the pure sensation, and look at the way Mark and Sharon, of course, talk about the sensations created by the vaults rather than by the vault itself. And it's through these sensations that we get a kind of thingness, a kind of materiality. Let me very quickly say, Lacan tells a little story about a friend's collection of matchboxes, and they're the pasteboard matchboxes, so if you slide the little drawer out, you can fit them all together, right? And he says that this matchbox ran along the mantelpiece, climbed the wall, extended to the molding, and even to the window, and it reveals what Lacan calls a thingness that the ordinary object does not have. This is Lacan. He says, by arranging the matchboxes this way, he raised the object to the dignity of the thing. Thing for Lacan is that intense, unnameable, unrepresentable, unmetaphorical materiality, which is the start of any kind of art. He says it removed its utility. This isn't even a type in the Platonic sense. It's not an abstract matchbox. It is that the matchbox all by itself is a thing with a coherence of being. And it's the singularity of being, this thingness, which I think the manipulation of the arch does in that work. And I think in a way, my job is easy when I get to the work of First Office, because I think the blankness and the post-conceptual, I think, fits into this materiality of inscription. What I would only add is that the shotgun house, and it's so-called, they call this Duchamp's shotgun. What I want to say is it's not Duchamp's shotgun. The shotgun house is itself a symptom. It is a leftover kind of shell of a building type with intense and varied social content. When the content is abandoned, it simply becomes a symptom of many social events, especially in the Deep South, but also the resuscitation of shotgun houses has a deep social history that goes away, and the house is left as a symptom. The house is the shotgun house. What their shotgun house is a re-inscription of the symptom, and the symptom is already an inscription. So it's a re-inscription of an inscription. It's a footnote, if you will. But what makes it, so it's not architecture yet. What makes it architecture north, not Duchamp, I'll tell you why. What makes it architecture, this point, make the door swing both ways. That is architectural. The moment of architecture makes the whole house architecture. What happens in regard to form is that we don't start with form, but the event of reading, the event of countering architecture, it's there that we project. The molding is a trigger, cut is a trigger, the idea of arch as a single signifier in solitude is the trigger that makes us project, that makes us produce architecture. And it all comes down to small inscriptions like that, which Duchamp didn't have some molding. I did it in 8 minutes.
That was fantastic, Michael. That was like the first response. Yeah, it was great. These are all on. I think they're on, yeah. So there's a lot on the table that is, and Michael has given us a way of integrating that right away, integrating the work that has been shown. And there are other ways in which the work is integrated, I think, also, but perhaps the presenters want to say something about each other's work to begin with also, and you can respond to whoever you like, including Michael, if as the responder. Yeah.
Well, I just have tremendous admiration for my fellow presenters. I'm not being nice, just to be nice, but I think, for very different ways. I think Anton, we talked about being discomfort, and I think Anton and Deborah's work make us feel like urbanites who have bureaucratic urbanites who have 9-to-5 jobs, and Andrew and Anna's work make us feel a bit like kind of uncultivated Luddites who also have 9-to-5 jobs. I also, I think for me, and I think for Shoshan and myself, who are educated during the times of when assemblage was a very important voice of our generation, to hear Catherine and Michael, two editors, and talk about our work, we felt like we've made it, we can exit the scene right now. But I think, generally, I know both of your work very well. I think there are two things that came to my mind. One is the issue of the core. I think Harvard Design Magazine a few years ago came up with the issue of the core. When I see Deborah and Anton's work, I see the Doman, both in, Deborah, you showed the tectonic project, with the beams, and the, let's say, stereotomic projects with the casting. I mean, both of them is the core itself. You know, I can't help but think about the primitive hut. I can't help but think about Lojie's narrative of the primitive hut, of the necessity of the caveman, where he moved from the cave, and eventually he came to that one moment where he erected 4 posts and beams and a roof. And Logie said, well, you know, he will continue to put skin around this to close it. But he pauses that moment right there. He said, no, we don't need to go there. This is that moment. I want to freeze frame this. This is the essence where the entire classical architecture came from. And I see that in the project of the dome, and I see that in the project of both this tectonic and stereotomic that you have. And I think the challenge is also, once the core is done, everything you put on could compromise the core. And I think of historical examples. I think of Corbusier, Maison Domino. When he had to clad Maison Domino, he had another project. He had the horizontal window, he had the cubist forms. So that became something else, where Mies cladded his primitive hut in Farnsworth with almost nothing. You know, so every time I think, when I see I wonder if I should freeze frame your project at that one moment, or is everything that comes after becomes a compromise? I'm thinking, because I feel we're able to look at it in kind of critical distance, because like in our practice we would never be able to like reappropriate a concrete beam that we found abandoned in a precasting factory, just like in terms of the different geographies and culture that we operate. So I'm looking at it in a way that, okay, if we're a team, how could we solve this issue? The second thing is more of a parallel. I'm thinking of, I think we also look at art early on in our career, you know, so I'm thinking about the position of conceptual art and post-conceptual art at this very moment in relationship to the historical moment 50 years ago. And I think of art movements, like what is the cultural currency of translating or transferring art practices into architecture, and which are the ones historically that are effective and which are the ones that are less effective. You know, I think of currently or recently, this whole issue of relational aesthetics never gained any traction in architecture, because already what they were interested in, this relational, this participation is already intrinsic in our work, in architecture, you know. So I'm thinking of when conceptual art first came out as a reaction to abstract expressionism, and then the parallel movement of pop happening at the same time. And I'm talking about the early ones, you know, and perhaps post-conceptual art came out as a way to fuse something that happened with pop and early hardcore, Soloist, Marvin Morris, that type of conceptual art. Now, so I'm thinking, I'm not so much asking a question, but thinking, what's the zeitgeist right now? You know, where is our generation or the generation around us reacting against or moving towards? Oh, there's a third point. No.
I guess in a sense, I mean, I say this only half jokingly, dolmens, just to say that there is a kind of, I mean, clearly, what I was thinking when I was, both people were presenting, Anna worked with Mark and Sharon before we started First Office, and it's a firm whose work we looked at a lot before we did stuff. And we still look at it now, you know, as a kind of source of inspiration. But I just mean as a kind of precedent in the way in which you think of things traditionally. And then you put things out into the world, and then there's like the stuff that people send you that your work reminds them of. And the number of times I've received emails with images of Deborah's work in it as a kind of alternative position, a completely different narrative about a very similar sensibility. I mean, even the way in which we present the work, obviously, it's quite different in its presentation, even though if it very clearly shares certain a kind of formal vocabulary, although the processes and the stories are totally different. And so I guess for me, that's sort of what we're kind of trying to get at, is that there's all kinds of different ways, and this is a group, but I think it happens twice, at least for us. There's all these different ways in which start our stuff, and the way in which we are sort of, it moves along. and we're trying to be more honest about the kind of non-linearity or the slightly, I think people think of us as precise, and it's only because of moments like this that force us into a kind of precision, but mostly we're just kind of like looking at stuff and people are sending us stuff and we're just trying to respond to it. And this is, at least for us, was a moment to think about those specifically, and then now watching the work, and I think in some of the things that Michael was getting at, is the different ways in which those things have influenced us both before, during, and now, after, and then as a way to kind of rethink, tell a completely different a set of.
I think there's so much of interest. Of interest that's interesting here. It's very interesting. It's all very interesting, and it kind of comes in. I mean, and yet, why are we? And it's funny that we want to find in it immediately the definitive moment that architecture arrives, on the scene. I mean, I'm thinking of the what you were pointing to, Michael, and the necessary small sort of inscriptional moment, and why we have to define that moment and how that definition of that moment has changed over time, and what counts as architectural now in a certain sense. I mean, I'm thinking also of Deborah's work and a little bit because it's got to count that you're putting down rebar into the ground. Why isn't that the beginning? Why would it be the moment that you make the cut, right? Why isn't the moment you put in the rebar, or you begin the minute you look at the ground that way, the minute you start excavating the ground for setting up a site, or that you already have a kind of formal preconception of how it's going to be carved out and then molded and so forth. So all of those are long-standing things that are previews for what we do architecturally. And so that kind of I would say I'm very interested in precedent these days, and I'm curious about how the precedents work. Do they have to go backwards do they have to be stripped down in order to recompose themselves in relationship to how you're proceeding in that process? And I would be interested in the Duchamp door precedent. You're right that there's a necessity. Now it's necessary to architecturalize it. Otherwise, you wouldn't. Its whole point was metaphoric. It was about the sort of shutting this door and opening the other. So you have to give it some kind of mechanics or something to give it that sort of architectural possibility of operating in a house actually as a door. Or something like that. So I'm just thinking that these precedents, it's fantastically interesting how we operate on that. And there's also a critical operation on critical precedents that is emerging all over the place. And I think that's really, I would identify the hardest one of those. And I don't know if this is where this group is going or not. I mean, in some sense, I think it is. The hardest one for me is like the sort of trying to dig out from the aesthetic, the social justice stuff. I mean, I don't quite know how by being honest about architecture, which means we look at all of its mundane and banal pieces, which are not mundane and banal. The minute you put your eye on them, the minute you focus on them, they become incredibly fascinating and administrative managerial aspects that you can't do without, and frameworks and bracketing and everything else. So I'm very interested in how, that's it's the turning of the architectural tension on things that is really so powerful in every case here. And yet, anyway, I have to ask this question a bit about it.
I mean, maybe to link it back to Michael's category of these being material practices, it strikes me that material practice would have to be linked to labor practice, and then that becomes potentially a social position or a moral position. So, when you're showing kind of fabricating these tilt-up wall pieces, which are so beautiful, I hadn't seen those photographs before. It's like astounding to see those things. Or the construction site almost as a kind of theatrical mise en scène in Deborah and Anton's work, or we kind of myopically look at screw drives, etc. I think we're talking about the way in which those things translate into the way in which we work, and so maybe that comes back to trying to understand what it is to be a practicing architect and how we arrive at some of these positions, how we actually script those events, and who's actually working on some of these things, how we produce information for somebody else to build it versus for ourselves to choreograph that action, etc. I'm not sure if that directly answers the question.
Well, that does pertain to all three practices in really interesting ways, I think, that response. I mean, but I wasn't thinking of labor per se. I mean, I don't know if on some it looks like the principals of the firm do all the labor, is what it looks like from the photographs. So you guys are out there thinking it. No, but I mean, it's incredible that you go out and grapple with it. But I was thinking of the sort of more abstract, of course, claim that aesthetics is, this is underway now as sort of a new phenomenological problematic, is that aesthetics is, which is a distribution of the senses, as is said, that actually is headed toward social justice, that is brings about social justice over time. And because even though there's a lot of people that use aesthetics badly or something, or use it cheaply, or use it to manipulate you or whatever else, that the idea is that they just have the wrong conception of aesthetics, that they have a mistaken conception of aesthetics. I mean, so that was partly what I was getting at a little bit. But we don't need to go there so much. I think the labor question is super interesting also. But
So, in the film that Deborah showed, I have not seen a single one where they're wearing construction hats. So,
that's true.
So Andy can tell me, isn't that OSHA in Montana too? No, but I think, I don't know about where this social justice and aesthetics could go, but I remembered a quote of Jean-Luc Godard. And Jean-Luc Godard said, at one point in your career as an artist or a director, you have to choose between aesthetics and ethics. But no matter which one you chose, the other one will be waiting for you down the road. So I think it's a matter of point of departure. And I think it's in a way that it's intrinsically linked.
But also maybe, I think we both tackled this question of honesty at some point, and maybe we really, it means different things. But certainly for us, there is a strong aesthetic to the work, but it follows a certain honest approach to the way in which think about architecture. No, it is a consequence, and many times, as I was, it's more evident in the last work. It is, we encounter it when the work is almost built. No, we cannot fully foresee, the perfect final form. And actually, there's not a perfect final form. No, that's not relevant at all. No, there are, we are interested in, let's say, fighting certain battles, but we don't need to be in control of the full picture, and which in a way releases a lot of pressure and a lot of tension in the role of the architect, because architecture, by the minute that you just need to start thinking about how to license it, how to build it, how to discuss it with your client, how to then make it available for others to inhabit, you have to relinquish control. That's not something that that belongs to our world.
I mean, I find one thing that interests me, that I think distinguishes your practice from your work in a different way from our work with respect to sort of material and even precedent, that I feel that in a certain way your work is very sort of in a certain sense without precedent in terms of how you conceptualize it, but the sort of practice of building, the sort of empirical way that you understand materials, you recontextualize found objects in new contexts, builds up a kind of, it's like an internal language that helps you find, like, anchor the work. You decontextualize it and then find its sort of neighbors and its context through the method of working, which I think is, I mean, I think for Mark and I, and for you guys in a different way, the kind of role of precedent as a kind of, not necessarily maybe a heuristic model, but an intellectual framework, I think operates very differently. And so it was interesting to, I think, the kind of rigor of how you turn, placement of rebar or the sort of prosaic qualities of how material forms itself. It builds up a kind of its own rigor, and language is an important way that your work distinguishes itself from.
Yeah, it stays very close. Yeah. Is the interesting you use that term, because I'm thinking of precedent as like a kinship system, right? Where images start to, and work starts to ally itself historically, with other work, and then it comes to us in that way, in a sense. But it's, yeah, that's really, really interesting. Audience questions, we would like a few. I still want to hear more about not interesting at some point, but audience questions. Anybody want to ask a question in the audience? Yeah.
It was really enjoyable. It's just a quick question about how do you make that corner on the studios? The half round on tilt up. How do you form that?
It's two the corner. So it's two half rounds that come together to form in the middle, right in the seam. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of pretty crude, but it's not like a reveal or anything. It's just the sort of sandwich of the two.
Thank you.
Brute force.
Give the mic up behind you. Ted.
Maybe, as usual, less a question than a comment, but addressing the issue of materiality. And this goes back to Catherine's interrupted comment and the promise of friction, which I think wasn't delivered this evening. Because I think of the materiality of verbal discourse, and I'm very interested in the science of tribology, which is lubricants and abridants. So you have all the lubricants on file because the speakers, before becoming ex cathedra, each chair was equipped with a bottle of water and a microphone. As if to speak, one needed to lubricate and let forth the honeyed words, and we're all complimenting each other very justly because the work is beautiful. But so much for the materiality of spoken discourse. But in terms, and this is just a recommendation, in terms of written discourse, with Michael's comments, notwithstanding I think we need to think very seriously about the materialities of inscription, because through Chartier with Anna's discourse, inscription implies erasure from the very start, from the translation, say, from the waxen tablet to some more endurable form of transmission. But even, Michael, your very beautiful comment on the moldings with Duchamp, and moldings are described by a knife's edge, but the work that's done in putting things in print is, you think of effects like offsetting, for example, which is the result when prints are hung to dry and the sides of the ply touch each other and create misregistration in the print, which is interpreted as a sign of haste in the print shop. So it reveals the materialities of the inscription. And I think we should be attentive to those. And this is a lament, because Mark was wearing where a zeitgeist is. My fear is we're at a moment of loss of discourse. So the least thing I can do is insist on the very materiality of the discourse. And when Anna speaks about blank spaces we talked about earlier, read people like D.F. Mackenzie who talk about the necessity for the introduction of what he calls blank white space on the page as a form of legibility of text as such.
Yeah, I agree.
You can always count it and count it.
I agree totally.
No, the materiality is everything. Actually, it's like it can completely change the relationship. I mean, it can make the blank, to topographical or something, so on. It's just the blank is actually a sort of utopic state for anything. It doesn't, and so it's hard to have it. But yeah. So I think it's an interesting question and added a lot of different layers.
I'm also interested in this kind of smoothness versus friction. Yeah. And I think I'm also wondering what is the urgency for friction right now? I mean, in terms of, I think the pleasures, there's always the pleasures of disputation. And I'm trying to think of why was maybe the critical discourse at a certain moment works, and why is this generation maybe less adaptive to that? I don't know. Maybe it's not just a historical reaction to that previous generation, but maybe because nowadays we feel there's more ground for everybody. Maybe back then there are few journals, there are few publications. It's me or you, So there's this. I don't know. Maybe there's that kind of urgency, but I don't feel, threatened by. I'm not building in Montana, I don't know if, and I really appreciate, I don't know. I mean, this is a.
But I think that's a great question, actually. But I do feel that there's an urgency out there, and it may not be disputation. It may not be wanting to dispute everything in that old critical sense, but there's definitely an urgency of wanting to. I mean, I have people ask me all the time, well, who's going to write about our work now, in a way. And I don't mean that narcissistically in any way at all, because there are plenty of good writers out there, who in this generation and others that are working, writing about work. So there's a kind of sense of a definite repudiation of representation and everything that all the conditions of representation, what representation stood for, that actually had to do with that dialectical and that kind of, that sort of requirement of the revelation or the peeling back of everything, and so forth. So I think that now we're definitely in a different critical climate. I'd like to hear more about that from also. I'd like to hear more.
Maybe this is just an attempt at what I sense is a sort of urgent issue, at least from my students and from us, although we talk about it, is, everyone has used the word honesty in a certain way, and I do think that there is an anxiety about that, which is the degree to which we're honest about the type of work we do and the degree to which it can influence things outside of architecture. I think there's the sort of problem with overstepping what those limits are and sort of promoting a false promise for the capabilities of architecture, which I think they're not unlimited. And I think students are suspicious of that. On the other hand, they're suspicious of people who would make claims that they don't have any capabilities outside of themselves. And so when they present a kind of internal, a kind of navel-gazing narrative about their projects, they sense that as a kind of inauthentic response to what architecture does. And for me, there is something around that term, honesty, that seems to be, there is some urgency just given the kind of political climate. And I think being honest about where we can actually be honest is part of that. So I thought it was interesting when Mark showed the slide of when you were talking about the Menil project, and there was a photograph where you could really see the sort of material imperfections in in the roof. And not only could you see the ribs, you could see a kind of wobbly line as it ran into the darker wall that was sort of in the background. And I was shocked to see it because I would expect that to be Photoshop.
I think it's because the blank screen is wavy.
Yeah,
It's the,
maybe.
it's the substrate.
That's my
of
story.
the-
You're getting to my story. And I thought, I was like, it was a sort of shocking moment of honesty that I don't think would have happened a few years ago. You would never have admitted, not you, but just you would expect. And then I think there's a sort of honesty in Deborah's work through a kind of earnestness that is presented with the people actually building it. And I think for us, we would probably Photoshop it, but then we would tell everyone we Photoshopped it. That we would be honest about the act of cleaning it up, like not as a sort of post-rationalization, but just as an inevitable part of the process that you would accept, and that would be part of it. So you wouldn't hide it as a lie. You would just talk about it, and then you probably would like. A couple years ago, you would like screen cap the like Photoshop screen where you like have the magic wand tool or something like that, where maybe beyond that moment of honesty. But I do sense that as a kind of like revealing the ways in which we work and being more honest about our practices as a sort of friction, and at least in the degree to which I talk about my students, like they're obsessed with telling the truth in really weird ways that I was not when I was a student. You know, like I always like changed the shape of the site to like fit my project, and like no one ever noticed. You know.
No, I think we're still. I mean, I think we aspire to be. You know, I think this issue of honesty. I never thought about it, but I think Sharon and I aspire to be your generation. But I also feel maybe this slight difference is there because I think we're still came into being with this understanding the old adage that all architects are formalists, but we all have different ways of lying about it. And so I think maybe we pretend to be honest so that it covers other lies that we're telling. You know, kind of selective honesty.
Which we're not telling you.
I hope you're not too honest in the wrong way. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. When the posters went up, yeah, you can just talk. I was really curious, the form in question, what that was going to mean, and I was kind of racking my brain during the lecture and in the introduction, the definition of form. But it seems with the bookended Michael's response in your introduction, maybe it's more about the question and where uncertainty lies within these practices and to what degree or how it becomes productive. And so in that sense, I found it interesting that it began with a sort of discussion of the expanded field and ended with the precognitive as two very different questions or two very different kinds of indeterminacy, maybe the expanded field being about a kind of blending, and the precognitive about the kind of extents of what constitutes architecture. And if maybe we think about the projects under those frames, there are different kinds of indeterminacy. And so I wonder, as a question, whether one of those resonates more than the other in your practices.
Maybe Michael should talk what he meant.
No, just real quick, and I think it comes back maybe to some version of honesty. When Damon talks about materiality, I mean, obviously there's a materiality in the way that we all talk about it, which is like when you etch on glass, the inscription, the mark, is materialized in its making. But Damon wants to also call materiality or materialism. Kant makes a passage where he says we have to see, like the poets do, which is that the vault of the sky is not space with with planets and a solar system that we theorize. It's the vault of the sky. So he's making a very surprising observation, which is don't think scientifically, don't interpret, don't overcognize it, just see it as it is, just see it. And I think there's a lot going on up here. That's the other thing in common. I mean, see a gutter as a gutter, you know, not as an entablature. See a plug as a plug, a stone as a stone, an arch as an arch. And I think that's what I mean. Precognitive isn't quite right because it sounds like that movie Precog with the Precogs, but he means something surprising. It means don't over-interpret. First, just see it, and that's the materiality that I think is common up here.
Yeah, I would also add to that. I mean, I think I think that's very clear. I also feel perhaps more so, I mean, just speaking about the projects like the UCLA project that we showed, I think this sort of indeterminacy, a way that we find that interesting and strive to achieve it is through an attention to detail, or almost a kind of no detail quality. So like the whole idea of this thick wall is that it erases all other layers of the wall assembly. So it's thermally performative, it has a detail in its mold, and it has no trims, jams, it's all in that thing. So it can be read at multiple scales. It can be a detail or a wall or an opening, and there's all that detail is just embedded in that one move. And I think that's part of how we strive for that kind of. Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's the issue of thingness, but also Michael brought up the issue of meaning. I think when we look back at the heydays of postmodernism, we look at the references and precedents were so important, but then there were a few people that, like Frank Gehry or even Charles Moore, said, can we go back to Paleolithic? Can we go back to the fish, go back beyond pre-architecture? So there was a desire for primitivism on one hand. And I think when we did the biennial, we've noticed a generation of architects that perhaps came at the heels of the dominance of parametricism, that were yearning for some meaning in architecture. Or where is meaning now that we have had a decade of we can do anything we want? And that's one of the impetus that we find. So I find it interesting that when you read First Office work, that you see it's almost like achieving an absolute no meaning whatsoever. A little bit of primitivism, but also something devoid of meaning.
Meaning, but inviting the new. I mean, I think by not overpaying, actually invite not already known. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to adjourn a few minutes. You're okay? Okay. All right. Yeah, right. That's where we're headed. All right. Okay.